welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. I took the job because I needed structure and because I was tired of drifting through my own life like a guest who never unpacked. That's the honest beginning. Not a grand revelation, not a daring secret I'd always planned to live out. Just a tired person who had been moving from one temporary solution to another, telling himself that later would be the time when everything made sense. I grew up in a house where making sense meant being predictable. My father wasn't cruel, but he was certain. My mother wasn't controlling, but she was anxious. Together they built an atmosphere where calm depended on everyone playing their assigned role. My role, from the time I could understand language, was to be steady, to be low maintenance, to be the kind of son who didn't ask questions that made adults look at each other with that tight smile that meant they didn't want to talk about it. When I was little, I didn't have words like identity or gender expression. I didn't have concepts like exploration. I had a drawer in my mom's room where she kept scarves and costume jewelry, and I had moments when the house was empty enough that I could take one out and feel, briefly, like I was stepping into a quieter version of myself. It wasn't sexual. It wasn't a performance. It was the opposite of performance. It was like exhaling. Like not having to hold my shoulders a certain way or keep my voice in a certain range. I would drape a scarf around my neck, look into the mirror, and feel a small, steady click of recognition that didn't come from being someone else, but from being less defended. I learned to put it back quickly. I learned that quickness was safety. There were little warnings even when nobody said anything directly. A joke on TV about a man in a dress, the laughter in the room, the way my father's eyebrows lifted like the whole concept was ridiculous and faintly disgusting. A story at school about a boy who acted like a girl, and the strange excitement in the air, the way classmates looked for someone to mock. It wasn't just that people were unkind, it was that they seemed unified by their unkindness. It made the boundaries feel like laws of physics. If you crossed them, you didn't simply make a choice, you fell out of the world. So I did what a lot of people do when they don't feel safe inside their own curiosity. I split myself. I created a version that lived in daylight and a version that lived in the back of my mind. The daylight version was helpful, polite, good at school, quiet enough to be praised for being mature. The other version was made of stray images and questions, and it didn't go away just because I tried to ignore it. It waited. It kept returning in small ways. The softness of a fabric in a store that made me stop and then pretend I hadn't stopped. The envy I couldn't name when I watched girls in my class experiment with style and presentation the way you might experiment with music, like it was allowed to be a phase, allowed to be messy. The strange grief I felt when puberty arrived and my body began to choose a direction that felt less like becoming and more like being assigned. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even tell myself in a straightforward way. I told myself vague stories. I was sensitive. I was private. I just didn't fit the usual mold, but plenty of people didn't. I could still be normal if I tried hard enough. Trying hard enough became my main hobby. In college, freedom showed up in the way it does for a lot of people, in the absence of surveillance. I could walk to the campus library at midnight and nobody asked where I was going. I could buy whatever I wanted, as long as my bank account allowed it, and nobody looked through my bag. I could have a roommate who wasn't invested in my childhood story. But I was also dealing with the downside of freedom, which is that it removes excuses. When you finally have room to breathe, you start noticing what you've been holding in. The first time I bought something for myself that wasn't meant for me, it was a simple cardigan from a thrift store. Not a costume. Not a dramatic gesture. Just a soft, oversized sweater in a muted color that could have belonged to anyone. I told myself I bought it because it looked warm. I told myself it was unisex. Both were true, and neither was the point. The point was that I carried it back to my room like it was fragile, like it might dissolve if I exposed it to daylight. I hung it in my closet and didn't wear it for weeks because the fear was larger than the object. When I finally put it on, alone in my room, I didn't feel like I'd crossed into some other category of person. I felt like I'd reclaimed a small, private permission. The sensation was gentle but profound. Not like fireworks, like quiet. It's hard to explain without making it sound dramatic. It wasn't, I discovered who I really am. It was more like, oh. This is part of me that I've been treating like contraband. And it doesn't deserve that. But even in college, I kept everything contained. I didn't want to become a story. I didn't want to become the kind of person people talked about with raised eyebrows or whispered speculation. I had enough anxiety already. I was keeping up my grades, working part-time, trying to act like I knew what I was doing. I told myself I would sort it out later. Then later arrived the way it often does, not as a planned moment, but as a slow accumulation of consequences. After college I took a series of jobs that looked fine on paper but felt like wearing the wrong shoes. Nothing was catastrophically wrong. Nobody yelled at me. I wasn't suffering some dramatic tragedy. I was just quietly miserable, the kind of miserable that doesn't look like anything from the outside. The kind where you wake up already tired, where you measure your days by how much endurance they require. I moved to a different city thinking distance would solve a problem I couldn't name. It didn't. Distance just made the problem clearer, because there were fewer distractions. Around that time, I started reading more personal essays and memoirs, not as research, but as survival. People wrote about anxiety, depression, family expectations, the pressure to be normal, and it helped me feel less alone. Sometimes there were stories about gender expression, about people who didn't fit the categories they were handed. I read those slowly, carefully, like they were mirrors I wasn't sure I was allowed to look into. I didn't suddenly decide I was anything in particular. What changed was that I stopped pretending the question didn't exist. The job listing found me on a night when I couldn't sleep. I was scrolling through a site that posted domestic positions for private households, assistant roles, live-in roles, work that required discretion and reliability more than it required a traditional career track. I had experience managing schedules, doing errands, handling logistics. I'd become good at being useful. Being useful was the one identity that had always felt safe. The listing was unusual not because it was explicitly about feminization, that word wasn't in the headline, but because it was precise about expectations in a way most listings weren't. It described a household run by someone who wanted a live-in assistant to support daily routines, social obligations, and home management. It emphasized etiquette, presentation, and consistency. It mentioned a contract. It mentioned boundaries. It mentioned that the role required comfort with a specific dress code and public presentation style. I reread it 3 times. The careful part of my mind said, this is too strange. The honest part of my mind said, this is a doorway. I sent a message, and even that felt like stepping off a cliff. I kept it professional. I asked clarifying questions. I didn't reveal anything personal. I expected to be ignored. Instead, I received a response within a day. The tone was calm, clear, respectful. The person, she asked me to call her Mara, said she preferred to meet in a public place for an initial interview, and she provided details that made it feel safe, a time, a cafe, the assurance that I could bring questions, that nothing would be decided on the spot, that the contract would be reviewed in advance. I told myself I was doing this as an adult, responsibly, with caution. That was true. But I was also doing it because some part of me wanted to be seen without having to perform the usual version of myself. When I met Mara, she didn't look like a villain or a fantasy. She looked like a person with a busy life who had learned what she needed and was willing to be direct about it. She was older than me by maybe 10 years. Not intimidating, just composed. The kind of composure that comes from knowing your boundaries. We talked about my experience first, the practical parts. Then she slid a folder across the table. This is the contract, she said. You don't need to decide anything now. Read it. Sit with it. If you have concerns, we talk. If it doesn't work for you, no pressure. I opened it with hands that felt too clumsy. The contract was detailed in a way that startled me. There were sections on wardrobe, grooming, speech, etiquette, public presentation. It wasn't obscene or sexual. It wasn't written like a dare. It was written like an employment agreement with an additional layer, a role-based feminization requirement that extended beyond the home into certain public contexts. The words made my stomach tighten, and not just from fear. There was something else, something I didn't want to admit at that cafe table. Relief. Because it wasn't vague. It wasn't figure it out. It was a structure, a set of rules, a clear beginning and end to the ambiguity. I asked why. Not in an accusatory way, just honestly. Mara looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding how much truth I could handle without turning it into entertainment. I've hosted events for years, she said. I've had assistants. It always becomes personal in ways people don't anticipate. Some people start trying to impress me, some resent me, some bring their chaos into my home. This contract is a filter. It requires someone who can handle discipline, routine, and reflection. The presentation requirement isn't meant to humiliate. It's meant to keep the role consistent. It's also meant to prevent confusion with guests and staff who expect a certain aesthetic. I didn't fully understand. But I understood the seriousness. And I understood something else, she wasn't asking for my secret. She wasn't demanding confession. She was offering a job with conditions. The ethical weight hit me later, in my apartment, reading the contract again. Because a contract like that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. I knew that. I'd read enough stories to know how coercion can hide behind an agreement. So I scrutinized everything. There were clear exit clauses. There were protections, my right to private time, my right to medical care, the ability to renegotiate. It explicitly prohibited sexual contact as part of the role. It required mutual consent for changes. It encouraged me to seek outside support if the role caused distress. That last line made me pause. If the role causes distress. I sat on my bed with the contract in my lap and realized that distress was already part of my life. It just didn't have a name. It was the background hum of self-rejection. The difference here was that the distress would be visible, definable, something I could face rather than drown in. I called Mara and asked if we could meet again. This time I didn't pretend I was purely practical. I told her I was nervous. I told her I needed to understand how she handled power dynamics. I asked what would happen if I felt overwhelmed. I asked whether I could consult a lawyer. She said yes, to all of it without irritation, which mattered more to me than any comforting phrase. 2 weeks later I signed. Moving into her home felt like entering a different climate. The house wasn't extravagant in a dramatic way, but it was carefully maintained, like every object belonged on purpose. There was a guest suite for me with its own bathroom. There were house rules posted discreetly in a binder. Routine was built into the architecture of the place. I could see how someone like Mara survived her life by designing it. The first day included practical orientation. The second day included wardrobe. Mara didn't hand me a costume. She handed me basics, fitted trousers, simple blouses, a cardigan, comfortable flats, a coat that fell in a way that changed my silhouette without making me feel like I was pretending to be a stranger. The colors were neutral. Everything was appropriate for errands, appointments, a polite social event. She explained grooming expectations with the same tone you'd use to explain a uniform at a high-end hotel. Hair neat. Skin cared for. Nails clean. No heavy makeup, just enough to look put together. Fragrance minimal. Posture aware. Then she said, and speech. That part terrified me more than clothing. Clothing could be removed in private. Speech lived inside you. Speech was how you were recognized. She gave guidelines, not caricatures. No exaggerated pitch. No forced softness. The expectation was clarity, warmth, fewer abrupt phrases. Less defensive humor. More direct politeness. She wanted me to slow down when I spoke, to stop dropping my voice at the end of sentences like I expected to be contradicted. I didn't realize how much of my old voice was armor until someone asked me to put the armor down. The first time I went out in public under the contract, it was to a grocery store. Mara didn't come. She said, "You'll learn more by doing it without my shadow." That sounded like trust, but it also sounded like a test. Maybe it was both. I remember the parking lot, the wind, the way my hands shook around the shopping list. I remember telling myself, "You are not doing anything wrong. You are wearing clothes. You are buying food. People are thinking about their own lives." But my body didn't believe me. My body thought we were in danger. Inside the store, nobody screamed. Nobody pointed. A cashier said, "How are you today?" and I managed to answer without my voice cracking. I walked back to the car and sat there for a long moment with my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing like I'd run a race. That was the first tension. The reality was less dramatic than my fear, but the fear was still real. As weeks passed, the routine became familiar. I learned how to manage Mara's calendar, how to coordinate with vendors, how to prepare for gatherings. I learned the etiquette she valued, greeting guests with calm professionalism, anticipating needs without hovering, speaking with enough confidence that people didn't question whether I belonged in the room. And the contract required that I do it in a feminine presentation. At first I told myself it was just a uniform, like any other job. I repeated that phrase internally whenever I felt overwhelmed. It's just work. It's just work. But something strange happened as I repeated it. The phrase began to sound less true. Because the more I lived this way, the more my nervous system stopped fighting it. I started noticing that I slept better. That my shoulders weren't permanently tense. That I wasn't bracing for the next joke at my expense because I wasn't surrounded by the people from my past. I was surrounded by routine. And routine, for me, was safety. It also made me notice how much of my old life had been built around avoidance. I'd been avoiding my own reflection, not just in mirrors, but in relationships. I'd kept friendships shallow because deep friendships require honesty. I'd kept my family at a distance because I didn't want to lie and I didn't know how to tell the truth. I'd dated rarely, and when I did, I played a version of myself that was acceptable, like I was auditioning for the role of a normal partner, rather than showing up as a human being. In Mara's house, I couldn't hide behind vagueness. The contract demanded consistency, and consistency became a kind of mirror. It showed me what I could handle. It showed me what I was afraid of. It showed me that my fear wasn't proof of wrongness, it was proof of history. But I also had to face the ethical question I'd been trying to keep at bay: was this empowerment or surrender? Was I choosing this, or was I using the contract as a way to avoid making my own choices? It's hard to admit, but structure can become a crutch. If someone else writes the rules, you never have to find out what rules you would choose for yourself. That question started haunting me in small moments. Standing in front of my closet in the morning, reaching automatically for a blouse, I would pause and wonder, if nobody asked me to do this, would I still do it? And sometimes my mind would answer, I don't know. Other times it would answer too quickly, of course not. This is just a job. And then, in quieter moments, my body would answer differently, in the form of calm. I began journaling, not because it was trendy or because I wanted to create a narrative, but because I needed a place where I didn't have to perform. I wrote about childhood memories I'd never told anyone. I wrote about the first time I'd heard the word freak at school and how it had planted itself in me like a seed. I wrote about my parents and the way love can be real and still be suffocating when it's mixed with fear. I wrote about how I didn't know whether I was crossdressing, or whether I was doing something closer to social transition, or whether the categories mattered as much as my well-being. Mara never read my journal. She didn't pry. But she did something else that mattered: she treated me like an adult with a mind. When I made mistakes, she corrected me without cruelty. When I seemed quiet, she asked if I needed a day off. When I asked to renegotiate a certain public expectation for a particularly stressful event, she listened and adjusted. That was the second tension. The contract could have been a cage, but it wasn't, because the person enforcing it wasn't using it to erase me. Still, the danger wasn't gone. The danger lived in me, in the part that wanted to disappear into rules. The first real consequence came from the outside world, not from Mara. One afternoon I ran into someone from my past in a bookstore. Not a close friend, but an acquaintance from college who recognized my face before my brain recognized theirs. I saw the flicker of confusion in their eyes, the quick scan of my outfit, the pause that felt like a spotlight. They didn't say anything cruel. They smiled awkwardly and said my name. I answered. My voice, trained by routine, stayed steady. We exchanged a few polite sentences. They asked what I was doing now. I said I was working as a live-in assistant. That was true. I didn't offer details. Their eyes did that thing people do when they're trying to solve a puzzle quietly. Then they said they had to go, and they left. I stood in the aisle shaking, because I knew what could happen next. Not because that person was evil, but because people talk. Stories spread. Details get distorted. And I had built my adult life on the assumption that I could keep this contained. That night I called my mother. Not to confess, not fully. I just wanted to hear her voice. I told myself I was checking in. We chatted about nothing. But my anxiety was so obvious that she asked if I was okay. I almost told her everything, and then I didn't. I said work was stressful. She offered advice that sounded like worry wrapped in practicality. You've always been sensitive, she said, as if sensitivity was a minor flaw to manage. After the call I sat in my room and stared at the wall and felt an old ache, the desire to be known, and the fear of being known. 4 weeks after the bookstore incident, my mind replayed it. I imagined the worst, a call from my father, furious. A rumor online. A job lost. I started scanning people's faces in public, looking for signs of recognition. Hypervigilance returned. My sleep worsened. And that's when I realized something important: even if nobody else ever judged me, my internal judge was relentless. The world didn't have to punish me because I was already punishing myself. I told Mare I needed to talk, and we did, one evening in her kitchen while the house was quiet. I expected her to lecture me about professionalism. Instead, she asked a single question: what do you want this to be in your life? I didn't have an answer. I had feelings, contradictions, fear. I told her the truth as best I could, that the structure helped me, but I was terrified of becoming dependent on it. That I didn't know if I was hiding behind the contract or finding myself inside it. That the social risk felt real, and I didn't want to hurt my family or cause drama, but I was also tired of living a half-life. Mara listened. Then she said something that I still carry with me: if the structure is helping, respect that. If it's harming, change it. But don't insult yourself by pretending the calm you feel is meaningless. I think that was the moment the job began turning into a deeper form of self-reflection. Not because Mara converted me, but because she refused to let me treat my experience like a joke. Over time, I began to understand the difference between shame and responsibility. Shame says, you are wrong for having these feelings. Responsibility says, you are allowed to have feelings, and you are responsible for how you live with them. Shame demands secrecy. Responsibility demands boundaries, honesty, and care. I started seeking therapy, quietly, on my own. I didn't need permission, but I told Mara I was doing it because it would affect my schedule. She supported it without comment. In therapy, I learned to talk about my history without turning it into a defense. I learned that identity exploration doesn't have to end with a label to be valid. I learned to distinguish between what I wanted and what I feared. I learned, slowly, that my fear of judgment was rooted in the real social consequences people can face, but it was also inflated by a childhood belief that approval was the same thing as safety. The third tension arrived when I realized I could no longer keep my family in the dark forever. Not because I owed them a performance of honesty, but because secrecy was draining me. I wasn't living dishonestly to hurt anyone, I was living dishonestly to survive. But survival is not the same as living. I planned the conversation for weeks. I drafted messages I never sent. I rehearsed in my head. I tried to predict every reaction. I finally understood a painful truth: you can't control how people receive your truth. You can only control whether you deliver it with respect. I started with my mother, because I knew she would respond with worry before anger. I called her and asked if we could talk privately, without my father on speakerphone. She immediately sounded alarmed, as parents do when they sense change. I told her I was working in a role that required a feminine presentation sometimes. I told her it wasn't sexual. I told her it wasn't about trying to shock anyone. I told her it was something I'd been navigating internally for a long time. I told her I was taking care of myself and seeking support. I didn't ask her to understand everything. I asked her not to turn it into a crisis. There was a long silence. Then she said, very softly, "Are you safe?" That question broke something open in me. Because it wasn't the question I'd feared. I'd feared, "What's wrong with you?" I'd feared, "How could you do this to us?" Instead, she asked the question that mattered. I said yes. I told her about the contract in practical terms, about the protections, about my right to leave. I told her I was okay. She cried, quietly, and I could tell her tears were complicated. Some were grief for the son she thought she knew. Some were fear of how the world would treat me. Some were regret, maybe, for not noticing sooner that I'd been carrying something heavy. My father was harder. When my mother eventually told him, because families share things whether you want them to or not, he called me with a tight voice and asked what I was doing. I heard the anger in his restraint. I heard the panic under the anger. He asked if I was being manipulated. He asked if I'd fallen in with some weird people. He asked if I was humiliating myself. I stayed calm as best I could. I told him I was employed. I told him I had signed a contract as an adult. I told him there was no sexual element. I told him I was taking care of my mental health. I didn't argue about whether he liked it. I told him I loved him, and that I needed him to speak to me with respect if he wanted to stay in my life. He didn't apologize. Not then. But he didn't disown me either. He said he needed time. And he hung up. That was the fourth tension. Acceptance is not a moment, it's a process, and sometimes the process is slow and imperfect. Sometimes people can't give you what you want right away. You have to decide whether you can live without immediate validation. In the months that followed, my relationship with my parents changed. My mother checked in more often. Sometimes she tried too hard, asking awkward questions, sending articles she didn't fully understand. I appreciated the effort even when it was clumsy. My father became quieter. Occasionally he would send a text about something ordinary, weather, a sports score, as if he was testing whether we could still exist in the same universe. I responded calmly, consistently, refusing to punish him for being slow. Inside Mara's home, life continued. The job was still real work, early mornings, long lists, obligations that didn't care about my internal drama. But something else had shifted. I no longer treated the feminization requirements as a temporary stunt. I treated them as one context in which I could show up honestly. That didn't mean I was suddenly free of doubt. Doubt returned whenever I thought about the future. Was I going to live like this forever? Did I want to? Was my comfort in feminine presentation a sign of something deeper, or simply a legitimate form of expression? Would I eventually resent Mara for being associated with this part of my life? Would I resent myself? Therapy helped me see that those questions didn't need immediate answers. The demand for certainty had been part of my suffering. I wanted a final verdict because a verdict would end the tension. But life doesn't give verdicts. It gives choices, one after another, and you learn by living them. The fifth phase, for me, was acceptance, but not in the way people imagine it. It wasn't a triumphant declaration. It was an ordinary morning when I realized I was no longer negotiating with myself every minute. I got dressed, made coffee, checked the day's schedule, and felt present. Not excited, not terrified. Present. The calm was not dramatic, but it was new. It was the kind of calm that comes when you stop treating yourself like a problem to solve. I also began to understand that my identity wasn't only about clothes or voice or presentation. Those were expressions, tools, languages. The deeper work was learning to respect myself enough to make healthy decisions. Learning to set boundaries. Learning not to outsource my worth to other people's reactions. Learning to treat the people around me with care, even when they didn't understand, without letting their confusion become my cage. Mara and I renegotiated the contract after the first year. I asked for more autonomy in certain areas. I asked for the right to choose a presentation style in some public situations, depending on context, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to ensure the choices were mine. Mara agreed, and she seemed pleased by the request. "That's the point," she said. "You're not here to disappear." That sentence stayed with me because it named something I'd been doing my whole life, disappearing. Not physically, but emotionally. I'd learned to make myself small to keep others comfortable. I'd learned to be agreeable. I'd learned to avoid conflict, to avoid being noticeable. The irony was that the contract, which seemed on the surface like a restriction, had forced me to become more visible, and visibility had forced me to develop real strength. The sixth phase, integration, didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like my life finally belonged to me in more than one room. I began rebuilding friendships with more honesty. I didn't announce myself dramatically, but I stopped lying. If someone asked what I did, I told them I was a personal assistant in a role that involved formal presentation requirements. If they asked more, I judged whether they were safe to tell. Integration, I learned, isn't the same as disclosure. You don't owe everyone access to your private life. But you do owe yourself the dignity of not living in constant deceit. Eventually, I moved out of Mara's house. Not because the job had gone bad, but because I could feel myself outgrowing the need for that particular structure. I gave notice properly. We planned the transition. On my last day, Mara gave me a simple card and a recommendation letter. In the card she wrote, "You learn to live inside your own choices." No sentimentality, no drama. Just a recognition of work done. Living on my own afterward was both freeing and frightening. There was no contract now. No one telling me what to wear. No routine designed by someone else. I had to decide who I was when nobody was watching, and that turned out to be the real test. At first, I overcorrected. I tried to live like the old version of myself, as if proving I could. I dressed more traditionally masculine for a while, not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid that if I chose otherwise, I would be admitting something irreversible. But the calm I'd gained began to slip. I didn't collapse, but I noticed the tightness returning, the sense of acting again. So I experimented gently, like a responsible adult. I built a wardrobe that felt like mine, not like a costume or a uniform. Some days my presentation leaned more traditionally masculine, some days more feminine, most days somewhere in between. The point wasn't to chase an aesthetic. The point was to stop treating my body as enemy territory. The point was to move through the world without constant self-surveillance. My parents adjusted in their own uneven way. My mother became my quiet ally. My father remained reserved, but over time the anger faded into something like weary acceptance. The first time he asked, awkwardly, "Are you doing okay?" without contempt, I felt a surprising wave of tenderness. It wasn't perfect. But it was something. I also learned to hold empathy for people who didn't understand, without surrendering to them. I learned that social norms are powerful not because they are always right, but because they offer people a sense of order. When someone reacts badly, it's often because your existence threatens the simplicity they rely on. That doesn't excuse cruelty. But understanding it helps you keep your own dignity. It helps you respond with clarity instead of collapsing into shame. There were hard moments, still. A stranger's look that lingered too long. A comment muttered under someone's breath. A relative who avoided me at a family gathering. Those things hurt. I won't pretend they didn't. But I also had tools now. I had grounding techniques from therapy. I had friends I could call. I had boundaries. I had the ability to say, "That's not okay," and then leave a space without apologizing for existing. If there's an educational lesson in all of this, it's that identity exploration doesn't have to be loud to be real. It can be quiet, responsible, careful. It can be shaped by work and circumstance and still reveal something true. It can involve mistakes. It can involve fear. And it can still be worth it, because the alternative, living your whole life trying to be acceptable, has a cost that people don't talk about enough. It costs your peace. It costs your authenticity. It costs your ability to connect with others honestly. I'm not here to tell anyone to sign a contract or to follow my path. In fact, part of what I learned is that nobody should give away their autonomy in exchange for permission to be themselves. Structure can help, yes. But the goal is always to bring that structure back inside, to become the person who can hold their own life with steady hands. When I look back, I don't see a spectacle. I see a person who was frightened, who made cautious choices, who learned to separate shame from responsibility, who learned that self-respect isn't a feeling you wait for, it's a practice you build. I see a family that struggled and stayed connected anyway. I see a job that started as employment and became a mirror. I see a long, ordinary process of becoming less afraid. And if you're listening to this while holding your own questions about identity, about presentation, about belonging, I hope you take one thing from my story: you deserve to be treated with dignity, including by yourself. You can move slowly. You can seek support. You can make choices that protect your well-being and respect others. You can be honest without being reckless. You can be brave without being loud. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.